Welcome to today's webinar on planning your migration to Azure. So it's just gone past 11 o'clock, so we'll get started on this. So without further ado, I'll run through a few intro slides first of all before we get stuck into the content. But we will have time at the end of the session to do a bit of Q&A. But in the meantime, please feel free to put any questions you have into the chat. Megan will keep an eye on those for me, and we can pick those up at the end of the presentation. So starting with a little bit of background on Computerworld, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a UK-based managed service provider based in Yate, just outside Bristol. We're a Microsoft Gold partner, Dell Platinum partner, and VMware Enterprise partner. We cover a lot of products and services on our portfolio. Today's focus is obviously going to be very much around our Azure practice and our cloud journey offerings that we can help you with. And just moving on to the next slide, if I can get Teams to work. Our portfolio is basically split into three pillars: workspace transformation, infrastructure modernization, and security and protection. So as I said, today's presentation is going to be very much focused on the Azure cloud and helping you with those migration journeys. But we also offer a lot of services around strategy and architecture, managed services, consultancy, procurement, training, and support. So the end-to-end solution provider for you and your business. So for me, I manage the pre-sales team here at Computerworld. I've worked here now for coming up 8 years. I joined Computerworld back in end of March 2014, so I have my 8-year anniversary coming up soon, lucky me. So I've spent the last few years talking about Azure and helping customers with their journeys. And I've spent a lot of time putting together the Azure practice within Computerworld, and also a lot of my time spent doing multiple Azure certifications. And I like collecting badges. Outside of that, I've got a family, 2 young daughters. I love rugby union. I'm a massive Bath fan. Please don't mention our position in the table at the moment. And I've also rediscovered my love of Lego. As you can probably see behind me, I've got a few Lego models built already and many more stacked in the cupboard when I get time to build those in the future. So intros out of the way, let's now jump into the content for today's discussion. So when I'm talking to customers and colleagues out there around concerns and challenges that everyone's got in the current industry, the state where we are at the moment, there's several factors that are at the top of everyone's mind, really. Typically, the common themes I see are costs. So IT's having their budget cuts, they're looking to gain more efficiency, a bigger return on investment. So what we're getting in terms of the value that we're putting into the investment in IT, the business needs to get more out of it. The other one is security. This is a really big consideration these days. Obviously, cybersecurity threats are everywhere. You only need to read the news. There's security threats and incidents every single day. It's a daily occurrence now. So customers are asking us, how can I be better at protecting my environment and my data, my services, my application, and those sorts of things, while still allowing my users to work in a secure and seamless fashion without too much overhead on top of that. The other thing I tend to see is about IT priorities as well. So I speak to a lot of customers out there, and their businesses and organisation have got a lot of IT projects on the cards, and they all involve significant amount of resource. So it's about providing that balance of giving value back to the business whilst keeping lights on. It's a really big challenge today for a lot of organisations. So it's looking about how digital transformation can help unlock some of this time to value and help us be more agile and more performant and provide services quicker to the business and our customers. And cloud can help with a lot of that. So usually when we're discussing a migration to Azure, it always starts with some form of trigger activity. So there's usually a reason or something on the cards with the business that customers are looking to move forward with a cloud migration. So there's some common themes on here that I've highlighted. So lots of customers speak to me about data center refreshes or data center exits. They're looking to have that investment in hardware again. And now they're considering cloud. So where public cloud such as Azure can help them, rather than having that big capital investment, how can you move some of these applications and services into public cloud to reduce the amount of capital expenditure we're having on our on-prem infrastructure? Or it could be, we need to get out of the data center quickly. It's a colo, it's a big expensive contract. We need to get out of it. We need to move our services to the cloud. How can we best do that? And that's become a common theme in COVID, with businesses out there looking at their buildings, their their locations. Can we close them down? Can we consolidate them? Can we move to a smaller premises? We got this big server room. We need to look at how can we best deal with this. We don't want to manage that moving forward. How can we get out of managing this big server room? The second one is business continuity. So this is a really common one. How can I protect my environment against the worst if it were to happen, whether that's a fire, flood, ransomware outbreak? How can the business continue to function in the event of a disaster? And public cloud's got some really good offerings where we can replicate our virtual machines, our workloads, our data into Azure, and then recover the services quite seamlessly, automatically, and we can test it on a regular basis at a really, really affordable price point. So cash flow challenges are another one post-COVID. So like I say, organizations are now looking not to have that big capital investment all the time, once every 3 years, every 5 years as we've done in the past. Now we're looking at more of this OPEX model, so moving forward with a consumption-based plan. So I've already touched on cybersecurity, but this is a big one, how we can make use of Microsoft's cybersecurity protection. They spend a lot of money on cybersecurity, and obviously moving services and workloads into public cloud. You confront that with Microsoft security offerings really well, and it can be integrated and you get a lot of valuable information out of that. Rapid scale is another key point of cloud. So we can scale horizontally really quickly and really cost effectively. Very difficult to do that on-prem because that involves buying some form of hardware to do that up front. So we need to get all of that ready. With public cloud, we can do that without too much overhead, and we just pay for what we consume. And budget and resource constraints, again, IT be asking to deliver more with less, so it's how we can be more efficient, how we can look at our operational models and make some savings, and just generally be more efficient to the business. So as I mentioned earlier, it's about starting with that motivation. So what is the critical business event? What are our migration triggers, or what are we looking to innovate? So there's a mix of these reasons that we'd look to start with this. But when we're planning any form of cloud strategy, it's really, really important to understand why you're doing this. So have those good motivations, get them written down, and get them documented into a plan and move forward. So typical examples of critical business events, so a few of these I've touched on already, but things like mergers and acquisitions are common as well. How do we bring all of our resources together centrally, bringing together disparate environments, different locations, different user identities? How do we merge all those together? End of mission critical technologies is another one. So we've got a really key business application that's coming up for end of life. There's a new version. How can we use cloud services to move forward with this natively rather than just virtual machines? So a migration triggers could be get teams to work. Cost savings is a big one. So cost savings is really important. That's the number one conversation starter I have with customers. It's really important to understand the TCO rather than just the like-for-like costs against quotes and things like that. So that's something Computer World can help you with. Another one could be reduction in technical complexity. So, on-premises environments can be quite complicated. When you've got servers, storage, switching, there's a fabric underneath that everyone needs to be trained in and manage. Is that any value to the business? It may not be, but cloud, we can start to move to IaaS or PaaS services and just offload that onto the public cloud provider. So the next one could be innovation. So perhaps we're looking to do something a little bit different. So perhaps you've got a new application that we're looking to develop, and this could be a cloud native application. So why not build this in the cloud straight away from day one? So we can innovate quickly, we can fail fast. So if the application doesn't work, we haven't spent a huge amount of money on capital expenditure. We've just consumed the resources in the cloud for that project. And if it didn't work out, then you can just close it, turn it off, close it down and delete it, and then move on to the next thing without too much expense. So they're typical motivational triggers, and it's important, you document the right ones and understand what the real key ones are for your business moving forward to help you with this cloud journey. So the key thing not to forget in this process is identifying your stakeholders. So a cloud journey isn't just around an IT project, it affects the entire business. Digital transformation bleeds into not only IT, but every other department in the organization. So really understand who your key stakeholders would be. So I've given some examples in here. So obviously executives are the important ones. They're the ones who are going to allocate budget for this. They'll be setting the business strategy. They'll be signing off on the project. So bring them on board, get them involved from the start and understand what is valuable from them and what the key requirements of success factors will be from them. Tech teams are the other one. Obviously, bring them in from the beginning, ensure they understand the value of cloud, why we're doing things differently in the future, understand what training needs are, what their experience is in this new cloud world, and help them with that journey themselves to develop them internally as well. So the big one is obviously the end users. So how are they impacted? So the most successful projects is where end users don't notice a change. So they're not aware of anything you've done on the back end when you're changing things. But do they have specific needs? Really understand the value that moving to the cloud could bring to them in terms of some of the things we've already mentioned, particularly around security, home working, those sorts of things. So get input from your users, understand what's important to them. Your operations teams as well. So this could be a really important one. So when we're running a cloud operation, this is vastly different from running an on-prem infrastructure. So do we need to review our processes internally to make sure they're fit for purpose with this new cloud world? So there is a shared responsibility model between Microsoft, your cloud provider, and yourselves. So make sure you're reviewing those and understanding where the roles and responsibilities lie moving forward. And last but not least on this slide is obviously finance. We're changing from a capital expenditure model with cloud to an operational model. So OPEX, so rather than those big investments once every 3 to 5 years, we're getting that monthly bill from our Azure provider. And this is attractive to a lot of organizations, but not everyone. So it's really understanding what the needs of the finance team are and how the cash flow needs to be managed in the organization. So just to summarize on this, it's about identifying those business outcomes. Where do you need to get started? Start to understand your stakeholders, your opinions of the wider business, get this documented down, get this written and shared, and this should be a living and breathing document. So you may be thinking, okay, this is great, Ben, but how can we really get started with this? So fortunately, Microsoft and Computer World can help you with these assessments. So there's a really good strategic migration assessment and readiness tool, which is about a big mouthful, so I'll call it the SMART assessment here. So this covers 10 key readiness areas. So it's a question and answer response, completely free to use. And this will just go through and evaluate your current cloud position, where you are in your readiness, and it gives you a RAG report, red, amber, green scoring, and tells you the areas you need to focus on when it comes to your strategy. So that's a really good place to get started. The link's there, we can share that in the chat as well, if you need access to that. And Microsoft have put together the Cloud Adoption Framework. So what is this? So this is a collection of best practices and guidance that Microsoft have gathered through real world deployments over many years, over many customers and engineers. So it was created to give this framework for your journey. So every customer's journey is going to be, have slightly different requirements, slightly different choices, but the journey is going to be same. Your business plan is going to be unique to you and your organization, but your adoption journey is going to be similar. So this is meant to help you with that clear, consistent manner of adopting public cloud Azure into your organization. And it's for technical decision makers, architects, support, anyone who needs to get involved from the business side should be reading this cloud adoption framework. It's quite in depth, it's quite involved, it's very good, it's very informative. It's over 1,000 pages, I think, of documentation. No, I've not read it all yet, but I've read a large part of it. But in summary, it's split out into six phases, so 6 modules is probably the best way to term this. So starting on the left-hand side with the strategy. So this is all about defining your business strategy, what works well for your organization. Then once you've got your strategies defined, then you move into the planning phase. So this is around understanding your digital estate, understanding where you are in terms of what resources you've got, how we can start to move some of those to the cloud. Then we can move into what's called the ready stage. So this is where we're ready to go. So we need to start considering things like landing zones, which I'll come on to later. And then the adopt process, which is, getting started with that migration. So as you can see, before you even start to migrate any workloads, which is over on the right-hand side, there's a good 3 phases that we need to go through in terms of discovery and planning, which are really key parts when it comes to an Azure strategy. And then on top of that, we've got 2 underneath, govern and manage. So governance is all around policy, role-based access control, security, the framework, the guardrails that you need in place to manage your cloud environment. And that's really important if you're starting to do things like self-service. People can log on and create resources themselves. They need those guardrails to provide some sort of governance and protection without needing to go through IT. And manage is how we manage this environment moving forward. We need different operational models. We need a different way of doing things. They need to work with the cloud. So this process is ongoing throughout your journey. So the link there for the CAF is on the bottom, but if you just Google Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, you'll find it in the top search results. So to summarize what I've discussed in the first few slides, it's all about defining the strategy. So starting with your motivations, what you need to do, why you need to do them, what's really driving you, what are the business outcomes you're expecting. So engaging with your key stakeholders to make sure that all these business objectives and outcomes are captured and documented, and making sure that if they do change as part of this process, you're capturing those changes to make sure that the project's still going. There's no project scope creep and things like that that can derail projects. Understanding the justifications, so these support your motivations and outcomes, getting, building into that plan, and identifying your first project as well. So looking at those low-hanging fruits, the easy, quick wins that we can use public cloud for. We've already touched on a few. DR is quite a common one. Azure Virtual Desktop to provide end-user compute is another one. So there's plenty of options to identify in those first projects. So an important part to remember, and this is difficult for me as a techie, a through and through techie, is it's not all about the tech. Whilst there's loads of technology choices available to all deliver the same results, we really need to be considering the people, processes, and the technology. So we're driving a little bit of a culture change internally, so we need to get our people on board, engaging with the stakeholders, understanding what's important to everyone, making sure that's documented and shared. Then when it comes into planning, making sure we're getting that good, solid business case with that exec sponsorship. We're planning our strategies. We're talking about it with our business. We're not just treating it as an internal IT project. So the advice I recommend is obviously start small. Don't go big bang all in unless you really need to, but track it against the migration scorecard, review, look backwards as well as forwards to see what works well. And technology, so choosing the right tool for the job is really important. Gone are the days where there's one answer is the right approach. There's normally 4 or 5 different ways you can do things. Ultimately, what is the best way to do things for your organization is the most important one. So that could be different from others. You're going to have your own use cases, your own drivers, your own success factors. So it's really important to spend the time understanding what technology is available and making that right choice as part of this process. Okay, and once we've got a solid strategy and we're ready to move into the migration stages, this can be really split down into 4 parts. And this now is moving into the planning phase of the cloud adoption framework. So really to get started with this, we have to do a discovery. It's really important to understand, what do I have in my estate? What servers do I have? What workloads? Where are they? Who is responsible for them? What are the configurations of them? What is the performance of them? There's a large amount of things to consider as part of this discovery process. The key one for cloud, and I'll come on to this again later, is application dependencies. So some applications are going to be dependent on, for example, a web tier may have a dependency on a SQL backend. They may have dependency on on-prem DNS or authentication. So it's super important to really understand what applications are talking to one another. Otherwise, it can cause lots of problems when we get further down the line with migration if we don't understand them correctly today. What's also important is to understand the value of the application to the business, making sure we're spending our time and effort on those high value applications where needed. Yes, get started with the low hanging fruit, the easy ones, but sometimes spending a lot of money trying to move a workload to Azure just because you need to move it to Azure may not be the best option, especially, for example, if this application is going to be retired in 12 months' time and your application vendor is going to come out with a SaaS offering. It may be better just to keep it as is for now, perhaps lift and shift it, and then just re-architect it. It's going to be too much of a cost to do when it's moving to SaaS in the future. So one thing that's really sort of good to do, and I like this term, is a spring clean of your environment as well. So before you even consider moving anything, consider migrating any workloads, clean up your environment, get rid of all those old VMs that we're really worried to delete in case anyone needs it. Clean up file shares, databases, old backup files, everything like that. Just get rid of all the old junk, because when we're moving it to Azure, there's obviously going to be costs associated in this to pay for it. It's consumption based, so we don't really want to be moving any legacy old retired systems. Just get a good backup of them and store them in the most cost effective way. So once we've done our discovery, then we can move into the assessment phase. So it's about understanding our application set and what we can move to the cloud. There's some things that can't. It's not very common, but that could be a real showstopper if there is an unsupported application or service that we can't move to the cloud. It's also important in this phase of assessment to understand the right sizing of this environment. Typically, when we do things on premises, we're going to size things to peak. We're always going to talk about what the maximum amount of workload that virtual machine is going to need, make sure it's got all the hardware resources it needs, which is great. But when we repeat that in the cloud, obviously you're going to be paying for all that resource when it's not being used. So is there a different way of doing things? Can we look at some form of auto scaling or automation to change the amount of resources when it's needed and then scale it back when it's not? And then you'll get some real optimized costs. So the assessment tooling can discover all of this for you. It can give an as-is cost and an optimized cost as well. And making sure when we're doing these assessments that we're running them for a good amount of time. So we want valid information for this. So we don't want to be running this for 4 hours or a day. We want to be ideally capturing this information for at least a month to make sure we're getting all those business cycles in this data to make sure it's a real good picture of your organization and your workloads, how they're running in real time. So some customers may want to consider not just like the month, but if they've got busy times of the year as well. So there's some organizations out there that can be quite seasonal. So if, for example, if you retail, Christmas, Easter, those types of periods may be really busy, especially if you're doing web services and things like that. So it's really important to consider those as part of this as well and run those tools during those busy times to get a good steer. So when it comes to the migration side of things, so this is about thinking about how we're going to move things, how we're going to migrate things. So it's key to understand, what is the target service we're going to be moving it to? What sort of downtime can we tolerate? Is there maintenance windows we've got available? What application groups do we need to do? So we can group VMs together and move them into batches. So that works really well. So you need a real good plan when it comes to migration. So it's part of the output from the assessment tools. The tooling itself will give you a lot of this information that you need to help build those plans, but it really boils down to having that good plan. The thing not to underestimate is how long this is going to take. So obviously, depending on your end state, which I'll come on to later, what target service you're using in Azure, you may need more effort to do this. So if you're lifting and shifting a VM from on-premises to public cloud, that's quite easy to do. It's not a huge amount of time to do that. But if you're doing a bit of application re-architecture, perhaps you've got a SQL server, you're going to move that into PaaS, perhaps you've got some web services, you're going to move on-prem into app services. There's going to be some coding changes or re-architecture in the application. It's really important that you understand how that's going to take and how long and how much effort is required as part of this process as well. And then we move into the optimized stage. And this I'll use the word stage loosely. It's an ongoing thing. So when we move workloads into Azure, we're always looking to continually optimize them, continue to look at how we can get cost savings, more efficiency, more performance. So that really is an ongoing process that should be baked into your operational processes as you use cloud services. So just going back to the discovery phase. So as I said, look at your environment, understand what you've got, understand those dependencies and your needs, and also consider the people as well as the technology. So start to think about what training needs your staff will require to run this. There's going to be different skill sets required to run in an Azure environment than there are VMware. So it's important to bake that in as part of your cloud strategy, part of the process, and really understand the cost of your current environment. So I've had many conversations in the past with customers around cloud cost models, and what they'll do is, we'll take an infrastructure refresh quote and we'll take the monthly estimate for a cloud quote, and they'll get that monthly estimate and times it by 12 and times it by 3 for a 3-year investment and say, oh, this costs more than, or costs less than the Azure cost to do this. But there's loads and loads of things that are missing out of that. It's not a true apples for apples comparison. So we need to make sure, do business value assessment on this. Consider things like data center space, server room footprint, power, cooling, server maintenance, hardware warranties, licensing. There's a whole load of other stuff that doesn't get necessarily included in the hardware quote to make sure we're giving that real good comparison against the TCO. So picking the right tooling. So there are several options when it comes to picking the right tooling for workload discovery. So as part of the assessment phase, but it's important to discover or understand what the information is gathered out of each tool. Where is it stored? How does it work? How much does it cost is another factor. So the one to sort of get started with typically is Azure Migrate. So this is free. This is part of Azure. So it's free for 180 days, I think it is. And this covers multiple scenarios. So it really is this central hub of tools for your data center migration. So it's not just all about migrating workloads in terms of virtual machines and servers. We can do assessments on things like SQL databases, moving them to PaaS services, the same with websites and web apps. There's VDI style assessments as well. So there's a whole suite of products that we can assess using Azure Migrate these days. It's not just about VMs anymore. But aside from that, there's also a very wide plethora of partner tools out there, third-party tools that can add a lot of value around these. There are some costs associated with some of these, but if it's important to you to get a little bit more in depth or a little bit more value out of this assessment, then some of these tools may be a better fit than Azure Migrate, but this is where Computerworld can help you with this. So we've got access to both Microsoft funding and third-party tools that we can help use to give you that real good insight into your environment. So a little bit more on the Azure Migrate appliance. So most of you out there will be running VMware workloads. You'll have a VMware vSphere environment or a Hyper-V environment. It's your on-premises virtualization platform. So the Azure Migrate appliance is just an OVA or a VM that you can download and then do discovery. So it's just a virtual machine that runs on-prem. It reports into your cloud portal, your Azure portal, and you can do agent or agentless deployment. So the benefit of this is little impact to the source, and it covers a wide range of migration options. So what can it do? So it's across any platform. So it's almost hardware agnostic in some respects, but it can do multi-cloud as well. So if you've got workloads out there and other cloud services such as Google, AWS, you can import things from there. You can do physical servers. So it covers a very wide range of data sources. You can also do an inventory of applications as well for VMware environments. So this tells you what workloads and applications you've got on each virtual machine. With vSphere, you can do an agentless discovery as well. So you don't need to do push agents onto your workloads, which is really good. And it does that dependency analysis. So it maps out what servers are talking to what over what port, what protocol, and it gives you a really good understanding of a network map, so to speak, of your environment and how it works together. And this is really important when it comes to the migration phase because you don't want to break any of those dependencies. So as I alluded to just a moment ago, lots of you out there running VMware vSphere. So it's really easy, straightforward to get going with this. And the same tool can be used to migrate your workloads in the future if you wish to do so using Azure Migrate. So you can, once you've deployed, I'll just build this slide out. Once you've deployed the environment, you can then spin up this virtual appliance, start replicating your workloads to Azure, and the Migrate appliance will then orchestrate the replication of the VMs into your subscription. The key thing it does do is the ability to do testing. So obviously, I'd highly encourage you to always test your environments before failing over, just to make sure everything's going to work as expected, as intended, and that should form part of your proof of concept or part of the early stages of your migration process. But once you've done that, you can then migrate to Azure with zero data loss and minimal downtime. So yes, there's going to be some downtime whilst we do that cutover. There are some ways of minimizing that, but plan for those outages is kind of key for part of this process. So what do I get out of the tool? So you get some really good visualizations in terms of those dependencies, as I mentioned. You also get a good breakdown of cost summary in terms of where you're spending your money or potentially spending your money. And that's typically broken down into things like compute or storage, licensing. So it helps you to break down and understand what the potential costs would be to do this. So it helps you get that clear picture of what the environment needs to look like once you move it to the cloud. And like I said earlier, it gives you estimated costs. Again, these are estimated as well, and some recommendations on VM sizes if you're looking to do lift and shift. What it doesn't do, and this is part of where we could help with workshops and things like that, is understand where you can turn things off to save money. So obviously, Azure Public Cloud being very much consumption based, if something's on and running, you're paying for that service, whether you're utilizing it or not. So there are ways with virtual machines, especially, to think, well, if I only need to have this virtual machine on 8 or 12 hours a day and I can turn it off for the other 12 hours, then I'm saving a significant amount of money. So there are ways to make really good cost of savings. And you may think, oh, I don't want to be powering on VMs and things like that. But this is where automation comes in. So you can get playbooks and runbooks. You can create those, use automation to fully automate all of this and make some significant cost savings. So the whole purpose of doing an assessment is getting a good understanding of your environment and your data and your applications to make informed decisions. So this is really key as part of a cloud strategy. So it's very easy to get lost in the Azure calculator and making assumptions and things like that. You can get very sort of tied up in costs and go around in circles. What you really want to do to be successful is get that assessment locked in, understand your environment, understand your workloads, and get a good sort of baseline of where you are today. And then you can build out your plan moving forward. So how are you going to migrate? Start to think about the bigger picture, start to think about things like native cloud services, not only virtual machines. So the assessments are really worthwhile. We can help you with assessments as part of our services. We'll come on to a call to action slide later, but get in touch with us via your account manager if you want to talk more depth in it about assessments and things like that. So when it comes to how my end state is going to be determined, where my applications are going to go, how my workloads are going to operate in the cloud, there's this concept Microsoft have come up with, the 5 R's. So this is very much a strategic approach for each application when it comes to the desired destination. So what I mean by that is we've got choices we need to make when we're migrating, depending on what we want the application to look like at the end state. So starting off with rehost. So typically this is taking a virtual machine on-prem and moving it to Azure. Nothing really more than that. It's typically a rehost. We don't really change the application. We may change the virtual machine size, but we're just doing a lift and shift in effect. The second one is refactor. So this may involve some sort of code change, very lightweight though. So we, instead of using a SQL server on a virtual machine, we may use a SQL server natively in Azure. So we may have to change some connection strings and identity and things like that, but it's very, very low overhead to do that. But now we've refactored that service from a virtual machine into a platform service. Re-architect, so this could be some sort of more significant code changes for the application. Perhaps it's an application that was written in a VM and we scale that VM vertically on-prem, we give it some more resources when needed. But just by doing a little bit of re-architecture, changing the way the application scales, we could use horizontal scaling. So the application scales out on demand when needed to provide the bandwidth and the throughput, and it scales back in when it's not to save on resources. So we're using cloud in a more efficient way. So that could be an example of re-architect. Or it could be, well, we're going to rebuild the application. So this is taking, developers taking the code and starting from scratch and building it in a cloud native way, completely removing the need for any VMs and things like that, and using cloud native services that scale horizontally, as I just discussed, and it's fully built from scratch. Or the fifth one is replace. So I alluded to this earlier. It may be an application, business critical application you've got that you just want to move to SaaS. So it may be, okay, my application vendor can offer this to me as software as a service now. So all I need to concern myself with is the identity and the data, and I don't need to manage anything else underneath that application. And that's kind of the utopia for a lot of these applications, is to remove the overhead from the IT team into someone else's responsibility. But remember, still that shared responsibility matrix to consider. Whilst you're offloading a lot of the responsibilities to a provider, it's still your data. You still need to protect it, and you still need to control access and the identity to that application. So with these, if we think about the top thing, looking down, so it rehost, starting with rehost. As we go down the stack, the complexity increases, the time of migration can increase as well, but the TCO will reduce. So over time, as we work towards that SaaS or PaaS-based model, we should see our costs moving down. So it's important to consider the long-term aspirations of your workloads once you move them to the cloud. And then maybe you just start with a rehost to begin with. We just need to get the workloads into Azure. We're just going to run them to as VMs initially, and then our development team can then start migrating those into native application services, within 6 to 12 months, or the phase 2 of the project, or something like that. So it's understanding where your strategic approach needs to lie with each of these applications that we discover. So this slide just builds on what I've talked about earlier, but when we're talking about terminology, there's lots of buzzword bingo in cloud. There's anything technical related. So we mentioned things like IaaS, containers, PaaS, serverless, microservices. As you can see, we move left to right. We start to use some of these more cloud native terminologies. Things like serverless and microservices are key because they're consumption based. There's very little overhead from your side to get these services to execute. But to do that, you need to make sure you've got cloud native applications and you've built this into your strategy to use that. So there's no right or wrong answer. As I alluded to earlier, there's 3, 4, 5 ways of doing things these days. But it's just about understanding and documenting the best approach for you and your organization when it comes to this cloud strategy and migration. So Microsoft put together this diagram. So it's almost like a decision flow chart. So it's a good use case to run through this when you've got applications to migrate or to deploy, to understand what could be the best fit when it comes to public cloud to do this. So you could start with things like Azure Migrate to bring that workload in, or you could perhaps redeploy that application using more native PaaS services. But having a flow chart and a decision matrix like that can help steer you towards the best fit when it comes to application migration. So just going back to skills and readiness. So as I mentioned earlier, cloud computing is slightly different than doing things on premises. A lot of the concepts are the same. Things like networking exist on-prem and in the cloud. For example, identity, security, all the concepts are the same. It's just the way we do things could be slightly differently. So this slide from Microsoft is obviously aimed at enterprise organizations. So smaller businesses may have 1 or 2 people wearing many different hats, but it's also important to understand what training is needed and identify those skills gaps that you could have as part of this project. So in the early stages, this is really important to make sure that any training needs are met from the organization, whether you outsource those or do things internally, making sure you're considering all the impacts that's going to have on your team moving forward. So things like billing, for example, I touched on this earlier. So cost management. So in Azure, we can do things like tagging. We can put tags against resources and we can do chargeback and things like that. So the finance team may need to get up to speed with the cost management and billing side of things so they can attribute costs to certain cost centers and departments. So there's going to need to be some upskilling in that area, and that may not be something you do today because you can't do it easily on-prem. But that's one example I can think of where the skills may necessarily not just live in the IT team, they need to be thought across the wider businesses to make sure we're covering all aspects. So Microsoft, again, there's a link we can share here, the URLs in the slide, give us this cloud migration checklist. So this is a really useful tool to get started with this. So it works through with you the processes and the thoughts and things you need to capture to build out this migration checklist. So I'd recommend you have a look at this and start to populate it with your organization needs. And this then feeds into your cloud adoption plan. So what does it need to contain? Any prerequisites that we've got. So anything we need to do beforehand to make sure that what we're going to do is going to be successful. So document and define your priorities and workloads. So what are your first workloads going to be? So don't start with the most complicated ones. Where possible, try to start with what we call the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones, the quick wins. This is allow you to understand how the process works, what's involved, identify any challenges, and gives you a chance to reflect on things that you could have done better, but allows you to then establish timelines and things moving forward once you've got an understanding of how the migration process works. So align your stakeholders, so who needs to be involved when throughout the process. So in the early stages, making sure we're capturing their requirements, their vision, making sure that builds into this strategy and this adoption plan, and then making sure we're doing iterations of this. So we're not trying to do this as one big bang approach where possible. So making sure we're putting the time and the effort into each workload migration stage that we're going to do. So it's an iterative process. So we'll do a batch, we'll see how successful it was, change the process, understand what went right, what went wrong before moving on to the next one. So once we get to those complicated apps, we know the process really well. We've mitigated all the risks. We've considered all the dependencies and things like that. So it should just mean that once you get to the more complicated stage, the project's going to be more successful. And making sure we're given an estimate of timelines as well. So as I said, this process could take many months, could take many weeks, depends on the size of your organization and environment and what you need to do to get to your desired end state. So it's really important to have that plan and put some key milestones into that plan of when you want to do things, how you want to do things, who needs to be involved at what stage, and make sure this is documented and shared across the business. So again, you maybe think, oh, this sounds, there's a lot of work involved, but there is. But fortunately, Microsoft provide this template, which is a good place to get started. So this is a tool that we can use to capture all of what I've just discussed and align all of the technical side of things to the business outcomes and what it is we're trying to do and trying to deliver. So I'd highly recommend you download this template. You don't need to use it, but you can take sections out of it and put that into your own cloud adoption template, your own strategy templates. Work with us to help you define what these need to be. And it's a good place to capture everything centrally and get started with your migration process. So the planning stage, to sum up what I've discussed, so making sure we're understanding our estate. So what have we got out there? What assets have we got? What resources, where they are, where they live? Making sure we're capturing and considering everything in an environment that could need to move to public cloud. So making sure we're aligning everyone in our environment. So, making sure we're bringing together all the governance and security side of things, aligning the stakeholders, bringing everyone together so we're all working to the same goals and targets. Don't forget your skills. So skills readiness, identify those skills gaps. That's a really important part of the plan as well. And then create your cloud adoption plan. How are you going to do this journey? How are you going to deliver the business outcomes? And get yourself ready to start migrating workloads and then manage them once we've moved into the cloud in the future. So now moving into almost the ready phase of the cloud adoption framework. So landing zones are a really key part. Excuse me, I'm talking too long. So what are landing zones and why are they important? So a landing zone is just a basic building block of an Azure environment. So it in effect is everything you need from an Azure service point of view that's been provisioned and prepared in advance that we build the foundation to then host workloads on top of. So a very loose analogy to this is when we're deploying a virtual application on a vSphere environment, we're going to have things like we're going to have a SAN in place, we're going to have our network switches and our VLANs and subnets defined, we're going to have our compute nodes ready to host these applications, we're going to have our backup policies defined, our DR policies defined, our security policies defined. All of this in software, we're doing this in software in Azure cloud, so it's all software defined. All of this needs to be considered and built out in a landing zone. So before we move any workload into Azure, you're going to need somewhere to put it. So a landing zone covers 8 key design areas around identity, network topology, organizing resource, governance, operations, business continuity, and deployment options. So they're really important to go through this process and understand from your business how you need your cloud to look, how you need Azure to work best for your environment. So if I had to summarize this to a non-technical person, it's the cloud plumbing, it's the foundations of the house, it's things we need in advance before we put things on top. And it's a really important part of the cloud adoption framework. And it's an area that a lot of customers miss or don't fully understand. And it's really easy to get started with public cloud. You can just go up and sign up to an account, get a free trial from Azure, put your credit card on there, start spinning up services. But without the proper governance, without the proper landing zone in place, you could quickly make some very costly mistakes. Like I say, you could deploy the wrong size VM SKU, click the wrong button, deploy stuff in the wrong region. So having these governance landing zone deployments configured will help mitigate a lot of these risks, and also means that a lot of the questions and concerns you may get from the business have already been answered by having this solid resource configuration set up in terms of a landing zone. So again, if you need any following actions or any advice on landing zones, Computer World have got experience deploying these. Reach out to your account manager, we can help with the deployment of these as well. So now we're ready to move our workloads. So as I kind of alluded to throughout this process, is don't start with the most important workload. Start with the easier, low impact, low risk workloads and learn from the experience. Make sure communication happens across the teams, across the businesses, across the organization. Inform your users you're doing this. And the best response from your staff, your end users is, oh, I didn't really notice anything different, or, oh, it's working a lot better than it was. That's the sort of feedback, IT thrives on, that sort of communication, and iterate and learn. So hopefully everything's going to go really well and be really successful, but there may be some stumbling blocks, some unforeseen things that didn't get noted in the assessment phase, but you just iterate and learn from those processes. You just build that into the next time you've mitigated that risk and it doesn't happen. So the whole thing about this is it's meant to be a journey, so it's not a one size fits all approach. To optimize and manage is, once you've got your workloads in Azure, it's making sure that they are managed and you'll be in charge of them in the most cost effective way. So there are tools that I can come on to in a minute that can help you with this. So you can look at not only the cost optimizations from running the services and workloads in Azure, you can also look at operation optimizations. So what do I mean by that? Automation, really. So you can take a lot of the manual processes that you may have on-prem today and just automate those in Azure. And it's done really, really easy. And lots of these resources can be reused to help you with this automation side of things. It's a DevOps methodology. So when you're deploying a new virtual machine, you can fully create that end-to-end through ARM templates, scripting, bicep, however you want to do it. There's many different ways of doing it, but it will help smooth and streamline that operational process. And it also helps with the future planning as well, how you're going to deploy new workloads, how you're going to deploy new environments, what you need to provision, how you need to provision it, what's it going to cost. All of this is an important part of that, those day 2 onwards operations. So what can we use in Azure to help us? So there's a native service called Azure Advisor. So this is a best practices tool. So it will advise you on configuration. It will also advise you on costs. So it will make recommendations where you can apply reserved instances to save money, or if you've got a virtual machine that's oversized or maybe undersized, you could have got it wrong, assessed it wrong, and it's actually needing more resources because it's having an impact on performance. So Azure Advisor is really good for once you've got your workloads in there, for actually telling you how your environment needs to work, what you need to do to make it optimal. Security is another important one, to make sure you've mitigated all your security risks. You get things like Azure Security Score. There's lots of value in Azure Defender. That's paid for services, but there's lots of value in that as well when it comes to integration with Azure Advisor. Performance, again, lots of performance metrics, logs, and things you can use in Azure to give you real insights into your workloads, how they're performing, where any pain points may be, where you can make some savings or optimizations on that. Reliability is another one, obviously making sure you're meeting your SLAs that you've got with the business when it comes to terms of uptime and maintenance activities. And operational excellence, making sure you've got that efficiency baked into your workloads and you're managing your environment in the most efficient way. So it's almost meant to be that one-stop shop, so to speak, in terms of where to go on a regular basis. And as I said earlier, this is an ongoing process. This isn't something you do once. This should form part of your operational strategy, that you're reviewing this on a regular basis to make sure that that workload is running in the most cost-effective, secure way. And Azure Advisor will make recommendations and even make changes for you if you're allowed to do so on the fly to those workloads. So I've started to wrap up now, conscious of time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to leave some time for any Q&A. But this slide is really good from Microsoft. So this is bringing everything together. What we've discussed today is, in real life, the migrations can be complicated and a little bit messy to navigate, and it's never a smooth, straight line in terms of process. So it's important to understand that this is a journey. So making sure we're putting the right effort into planning and working with a partner such as Computer World to help smooth these curves out into a straighter line is really important, and we can help in lots of these areas. But it really is about that journey. It's not necessarily an A to B. It's an A to B to C to D, carrying on throughout your operational life cycle of that workload. So whilst you can sum up and say, okay, I can literally just lift and shift my VM to Azure, as we've discussed today, there's so many more things that you can do to make it better, more efficient. There's other things you need to consider. And just going through some of these steps on this slide will give you some real valuable information of what you need to put into your plan to make sure your migration will be successful. Why is this important? Well, this is interesting from Gartner. I'd encourage you to have a quick read of this article from last year, but it's still relevant today, of 6 ways that cloud migration costs go off the rails. So as you can see here, a few of the things I've mentioned and covered today, poor landing zone design, so for example, is one of the reasons why cloud projects ballooning costs aren't successful. I'd encourage you to have a read of this, and perhaps you can get some good understanding of where you need to perhaps put a little bit more thought into your planning and process. So this is a computer world slide. We've aligned ourselves in terms of this customer journey to the 6 phases of the Azure cloud adoption framework. So we start with the strategy, we're moving into the planning, and then into the preparation and into the migrate, with governance and manage going across the top. So where we can help you today is getting started with these cloud readiness assessments, so we can help you build that strategy, help come in and understand what your organization requirements are, what your needs are, the wants from the stakeholders, and help to build out that initial strategy plan. Then we can move into the assessment phase. We can come in and help you do the assessments, understand the workloads, work with you to get all of that valuable data out and start to help building into that digital modernization strategy. Talk about the 5 R's, the desired end state, and things like that, to help build that plan of how we're going to adopt cloud services in Azure for your organization. And then we move into the consultancy phase. So this is where we can come in and help do landing zone designs, landing zone reviews, workload migrations. This, consultancy is typically an iterative approach, if I can get my words out. So this will involve multiple stages, multiple stakeholders. We can work with you, with our consultants and our architects, to help mitigate a lot of these risks and identify how the project needs to work, how it needs to flow, what phases need to be involved, and make sure the project is a success before they're moving into the support and operational phase of the journey. So to summarize, we offer 2 services, cloud readiness assessment and Azure migration assessment. If these are interested in you, we can reach out to the account manager. I've got a link I can share at the end of the deck to make sure that we can help you. We're in the best position to help you move forward with your customer journey. So before I go into questions, I'm just going to skip forward to the slide at the end. But if you'd like to discuss any of what I've talked about today on a one-to-one basis, or you found areas useful, perhaps you're not willing to share on the Q&A today, but you want a little bit more in-depth discussion, please scan the link. I'm sure this will take you to a Microsoft Forms capture site, or we can share the link in the chat to get a one-to-one session with either myself or one of my colleagues to come in and work with you on your one-to-one strategy plan for your Azure adoption. Well, if you do have any questions afterwards, please get in touch. I'm more than happy to answer questions on a one-to-one basis as well, or book a session with me, and we'll happily run through either anything in today or anything outside of this in Azure in general. Happy to talk to you for Azure. But if that's everything, we'll probably wrap this session up. But thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you joining. And yeah, any questions, please get in touch.